My house was destroyed in a devastating fire. At 65, I went to my son's home hoping he would take me in, but he turned me away, saying his girlfriend needed privacy. Desperate, I reached out to the love of my youth, a man I hadn't seen in more than 4 decades. When he opened the door of his elegant home, he spoke only 3 words: "You finally came back." From that moment on, my life was never the same. But before I go further, make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing how far my stories travel. My name is Donna, and at 65 I believed I had already endured every kind of suffering life could hand me. I was wrong. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. I was in the kitchen about to brew a cup of coffee when I caught a strange burning smell. I thought maybe I had left something on the stove and went to check, but the moment I opened the living room door, I was hit by a wall of thick smoke so dense I could hardly see. Flames had already devoured the curtains and were racing up the walls. I froze for a few precious seconds. The smoke alarm should have gone off, but I would later learn the battery had been dead for months. One small oversight cost me everything. I rushed back toward the kitchen to grab my phone and call the fire department, but the smoke had spread everywhere, choking my lungs, clouding my thoughts. The sound of glass shattering told me I was out of time. The fire was consuming my house with a hunger that nothing could stop. My only thought was to escape alive. I snatched my purse from the kitchen table and ran to the back door. The last thing I saw before stumbling out was the portrait of Richard Collins, my late husband, blackening in the heat. By the time I staggered into the street coughing, neighbors were already gathering. Mrs. Johnson, my 78-year-old neighbor, rushed to wrap her arms around me as we both stood helplessly, watching the home I had lived in for more than 40 years go up in flames. The firefighters arrived only 10 minutes later, but it was too late. They managed to keep the fire from spreading to other houses, but mine was beyond saving. In just 1 hour, 4 decades of memories had turned to ash. The kitchen table where my son David once did his homework, the wall where his growing height had been marked year after year, the bedroom I had shared with Richard for 37 years gone. I stood on the sidewalk, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over my shoulders, staring at the ruin. Later, they would tell me it was likely caused by faulty wiring in an old outlet in the living room. One tiny spark had reduced my life to rubble. When the flames finally died down, nothing was left but a charred, smoking shell. The fire chief, his face streaked with soot, came over with heavy eyes. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. We did everything we could." He didn't need to finish. I could see the truth myself. Total loss. Everything I owned, apart from the clothes on my back and what was in my purse, was gone. That first night, neighbors who still had homes offered me shelter. Mrs. Johnson insisted I stay with her, but her little apartment was already crowded with visiting grandchildren. The Red Cross had set up an emergency shelter in a gymnasium, but the thought of lying among strangers only deepened my sense of being lost. I knew I had to call David. My son lived about 40 minutes away, in a wealthy neighborhood lined with trees and picture-perfect houses. He had moved there 4 years earlier after being promoted to regional manager at his insurance company. We had never been very close. Not the way a mother and son should be, but he was all the family I had left. I borrowed Mrs. Johnson's phone since mine had melted in the fire. "David, it's Mom," I said weakly. "Mom? What happened? You sound upset." "There was a fire, son. The house is gone. Everything is gone." The silence on the line stretched painfully long. "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm okay. just some scratches, and my throat's sore from the smoke. But I need a place to stay, just for a while." Another pause. "All right, Mom, come here. We'll figure it out." Relief washed over me so strong my knees nearly buckled. My son would take care of me. The next morning I stood among the ashes, waiting for the insurance adjuster. Right at 9 o'clock, a young man showed up with a clipboard and a camera. "Total loss," he declared flatly, as though those 2 words didn't sum up an entire lifetime. "How much?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You had about $200,000 in coverage, but after depreciation and your deductible, you'll probably get around $90,000, maybe less. $90,000 to rebuild 42 years of life." The thought was crushing. "Mrs. Johnson took me to pick up some basic clothes and toiletries with the emergency cash the Red Cross had provided. Now my entire life fit into one borrowed suitcase. I climbed into a taxi bound for David's house, feeling like I was crossing into a foreign land. When you no longer have a place to return to, everything familiar becomes part of another life. The gas station where I used to buy lottery tickets, the diner where Richard and I ate breakfast every Sunday, they all seemed like memories from someone else's world. David's neighborhood, on the other hand, looked untouched. Lawns perfectly trimmed, sidewalks spotless, lives moving on exactly as before. I felt like an intruder, bringing tragedy into their pristine world. His house was a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a red door. Emily's choice, his girlfriend. I had only met Emily 3 times in the 2 years they'd been together. She was 30, David 39. She worked at an advertising firm downtown, always full of opinions from wall colors to which wine should be served at dinner. I told the taxi driver to stop at the curb and sat there a moment to gather courage. "Just temporary," I whispered to myself. "Just until the insurance came through and I could find a small apartment somewhere." I never imagined walking up to my son's door with a borrowed suitcase would feel like one of the hardest things I'd ever done. As I raised my hand to knock, that hollow emptiness swept over me, the same feeling I'd had the day Richard died, like the ground opening beneath me. I didn't know then how much deeper I was about to fall. David opened the door before I could knock, as if he had been watching from inside. For a moment, seeing his familiar face, his father's eyes, my stubborn chin, I believed everything might be all right. He was my son, my only child. Blood had to mean something. "Mom," he said, stepping aside to let me in, but there was something distant in his voice. Emily appeared right behind him, as if she'd been waiting. She wore white jeans and a silk blouse, her brown hair in a neat bun, a smile on her lips that never reached her eyes. "Donna, I'm so sorry about your house," she said, her gaze fixed not on me but on my battered suitcase. I set it down on their gleaming marble floor, suddenly aware of how out of place I was. My hastily bought, cheap clothes looked pitiful against all that polished stone. I could still smell the smoke in my hair despite showering at Mrs. Johnson's. "Just temporary," I blurted out quickly, "just until I can get back on my feet." David and Emily exchanged a glance, that silent conversation couples have that shuts everyone else out. I used to share those looks with Richard, but standing on the outside, it felt like a closed circle I wasn't allowed in. "Let's sit and talk," David said, leading me into the living room. The house was magazine perfect. Everything matched, nothing out of place. White sofas that looked untouched, glass, coffee tables reflecting light from spotless windows. I perched on the edge of the couch, my feet planted neatly on the shining hardwood floor. Emily's eyes flickered, a small frown. "So, what's the plan?" David asked, settling into the chair across from me. not beside me where he might comfort his grieving mother, but across, like this was business. The insurance adjuster said it could take a few weeks, maybe a month. I was hoping to stay here until then, just until I can find a small apartment. The silence stretched longer than it should have. I saw Emily's jaw tighten before she placed her hand on David's arm, a gesture that looked supportive but felt possessive. "Mom," David began, and the tone of his voice made my chest ache. "The problem is, Emily and I really value our privacy here. We work long hours, and this house is our sanctuary. You understand, don't you?" I blinked, trying to process his words. I hadn't come to intrude. I could stay out of their way, cook meals, clean up, not be a burden. Emily leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "It's not that you'd be a burden, Donna. It's about space. This is our first home together, and we're still finding our rhythm as a couple." "I'm his mother," I snapped, my voice sharper than I meant. "Of course you are," Emily answered smoothly. "And that's exactly why we think you'd be more comfortable somewhere else, somewhere you could have your independence as you start over." I turned to David, willing him to contradict her, to remember how I had stayed up through every fever, worked double shifts to buy his college textbooks, held his hand 3 years ago when his marriage ended because Lisa left him for her trainer. But he nodded. "Emily's right. Mom, we think you'd be happier with your own space." Those words hit like a physical blow. My chest tightened, my breath caught. "Happier, David. I lost everything yesterday. Everything. I just think you'd feel better in your own place than here. You think I'd be happier alone in some rented room than here with my family?" I choked out. "It doesn't have to be a hotel," Emily added quickly. "There are some nice extended stay places near the mall. Very clean, very safe, and they even have little kitchens so you can cook for yourself." I stared at the woman who had only been in my son's life for 2 years, now telling me where I should live after losing my home. "And how exactly do you expect me to pay for these nice extended stays? The insurance money won't come for weeks." David shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. "I could help with that. A few $100s to get you started. A few $100s. As if I were some distant relative, not the woman who gave him life." My voice barely rose above a whisper. "David, I changed your diapers, cradled you through colic, taught you to ride a bike, helped with your homework. I held you when Lisa Parker broke your heart in high school." His face flinched, but Emily only gripped his arm tighter. "No one's denying what you've done," she said. "We just think we'd all be more comfortable with some boundaries." "Boundaries," I repeated. I remembered that word from the therapist David had seen after his divorce. "You're throwing me out," I said flatly. "No, Mom," David protested. "We just don't think this arrangement would work for anyone." "Whose idea was this?" I asked, though I already knew. I saw it in the way Emily leaned back, satisfied, like she'd just won something. "We discussed it together," David said, his eyes darting away. I rose slowly, my knees creaking, reminding me I was 65 and alone in the world. "I understand." "Mom, don't be like that. We're just trying to do what's best for everyone." "What's best for everyone?" I repeated, the words sounding foreign on my tongue. "What's best for everyone, David, is that your mother doesn't have to sleep on the street tonight." Emily's perfectly made-up face tightened into a show of concern. "You don't have to sleep on the street. Like I said, there are still options." I looked around the flawless living room once more. The pictures on the walls were only of David and Emily, none of me. The expensive furniture no one really lived in, and my own son who had chosen a cold, beautiful woman over his own mother. "You're right," I whispered. "There are always options." I picked up my small suitcase, suddenly heavier now that I knew exactly where I wasn't welcome. David rose too, his face uneasy, but not uneasy enough to change his mind. "I'll call you in a few days, once you're settled somewhere." "Don't bother," I said, my voice sharper and stronger than I expected. "I wouldn't want to disturb your little sanctuary." Emily looked briefly uncomfortable, but not enough to speak up, not enough to say, "Wait, this is your mother." I walked out of that perfect house, leaving behind the perfect couple with their perfect boundaries. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, frozen, before I could force myself to move. Through the window, I saw David and Emily talking, probably already discussing how difficult I was, how much drama I'd brought into their peaceful lives. I laughed bitterly. After Richard died, I had told myself I was strong, independent, that I didn't need anyone. But independence, I realized, is only a luxury when you still have choices. I dragged myself to a small hotel on the corner and spent nearly all the money I had left on a room for the night. Sitting on the hard bed, staring at the peeling walls, I asked myself where a 65-year-old woman with almost no money and only one suitcase of cheap clothes was supposed to go. That's when I remembered the business card I had carried in my wallet for 4 decades, miraculously saved because I'd had it with me when I fled the fire. Yellowed with age, its corners frayed, it belonged to a man who once promised he would come back for me. William Dawson, the love of my youth. Back then, one day before life got in the way, his promise had never come true. I stayed in that shabby hotel for 3 nights before I could summon the courage to call. 3 nights waking with an aching back from the thin mattress, the taste of shame still on my tongue. 3 nights listening to arguments in the hallway and the constant roar of traffic through a drafty window. 3 nights washing my few new clothes in the tiny bathroom sink and hanging them to dry over the single chair in the room. That fragile card felt like tissue paper in my hands. The blue ink faded. William Dawson. Beneath it was a phone number with an area code I didn't recognize. On the back, in my own youthful handwriting, the words, "Never forget W." I had written that when I was 25, believing with absolute certainty that William was the great love of my life. He was 26, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of amber. He worked in his father's construction company after college, full of big dreams. We were together for 9 months, which at 25 felt like forever. He used to drive me out to the hills on the edge of town, where we'd sit on the hood of his car and talk about the future. "I'm going to start my own business," he would tell me. "Something in construction or real estate. Something big enough to give you everything you deserve. I'll come back for you, Donna." He made that promise the night before leaving for a project in the capital. "I'll make something of myself, then I'll come back and marry you." But promises made in your 20s rarely survive real life. At first, he wrote letters, long, passionate letters full of dreams and plans. I wrote back, telling him about my job at the bank, telling him I was waiting like I promised, but the letters grew shorter, less frequent. 6 months later, when I met Richard at a church event, William had already become a beautiful dream too good to be real. Richard was steady, dependable, 32, with a good job at the phone company. He didn't promise me the world, but he promised me a home, a family, security. After 5 months of dating, Richard proposed, and I said yes. I slipped William's card into the pocket of my wedding dress, a secret talisman I couldn't bring myself to throw away. 40 years later, in a damp, musty hotel room that smelled of old cigarettes, I wondered what had become of that young man with amber eyes. From time to time, I'd heard about him through mutual friends. They said he had kept his promise, started his own construction firm, built something big. He never married, people said he was too busy building his empire. The last I'd heard, maybe 8 years ago, his company had expanded all the way to New York and Chicago. William Dawson, now a developer in a sharp suit, making decisions that affected hundreds of people. And I wondered, what would a man like that want with a 65-year-old widow holed up in a rundown hotel with nothing but a suitcase of bargain clothes? My rational mind told me it was ridiculous, pathetic even. Who calls their first love after 4 decades just because their life has collapsed? Who goes running to the boy they loved when they are old, desperate, and homeless? But when your money is dwindling, when you're counting coins to see if you can buy just one more night in a cheap hotel, rational thinking is a luxury too. On the 4th morning, I couldn't take it anymore. My back throbbed from the hard mattress, my money was almost gone, and the hotel clerk told me they needed the room for another guest. I sat at the small table, staring at the card, my hands trembling. What could I possibly say? William, do you remember me? I don't have a home anymore. Surely the number had been disconnected. Or if it did ring, some secretary would politely tell me, Mr. Dawson was far too busy to take a call from a stranger claiming to have known him decades ago. But what if it wasn't? What if he actually answered? My heart pounded as I dialed each number. 1 ring, 2 rings. Dawson Development. This is William. His voice was deeper now, shaped by time and responsibility, but I knew it instantly. After 40 years, I still recognized him. I nearly hung up, nearly ended the call to go figure out some other way. But there was something in his tone, some warmth that wrapped around me like a blanket, that made me speak. It's me, Donna. Donna Miller, now Collins. The silence stretched long enough for me to think the line had dropped, or he had hung up, or maybe he simply had no idea who I was. Donna, just my name. Spoken like a prayer or a wonder, as if he couldn't believe it. I'm sorry for calling like this. I rushed out, the words tumbling over each other in my desperation, afraid he'd hang up before I could explain. I know it's been forever, and maybe I shouldn't be calling, but I didn't know who else to turn to. Where are you? His voice cut through, sharp with concern. I'm in Portland, at a little hotel. I know it sounds crazy, but my house burned down last week. I lost everything, and my son doesn't want me staying with him. I don't have anywhere else to go. The words poured out of me, each one harder than the last. Admitting that my own son had turned me away felt like confessing I had failed at the most basic part of being a mother. Give me the exact address, William said, his voice suddenly firm, professional. I'll come get you. You don't have to do that. I don't even know why I called. Maybe I just needed to hear a familiar voice. Donna. His tone left no room for argument. Tell me where you are. I'm already heading to the car. Through the phone, I heard a door slam, an engine start. He really was coming. The man I hadn't spoken to in 4 decades was dropping everything to rescue me from a rundown hotel. I whispered the address, then added softly, William, I don't look like the girl you remember. Neither do I, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. But I've been waiting 40 years for this call. After we hung up, I spent the next hour packing my few things, panic and disbelief twisting inside me. What was I doing? What were we doing? It was madness. You don't just pick up a love story after 4 decades as if you'd paused it yesterday. But as I sat by the hotel window, waiting for a car I wouldn't recognize, carrying a man who might not even recognize me, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the fire. Hope. Maybe foolish hope, maybe hope that would only lead to disappointment and more heartbreak, but hope nonetheless. And at 65, with nothing left to lose, hope was worth the risk. At exactly 11 o'clock, a silver Mercedes pulled up in front of the hotel, gleaming against the worn-out street. I watched from the window, my heart slamming against my ribs like a bird trying to escape its cage. The windows were tinted. I couldn't see inside, but something deep in my chest told me it was him. The engine cut off. The driver's door opened. Even after 4 decades, even with silver hair and lines around his eyes, even carrying the weight of decades I hadn't shared with him, I knew him immediately. William stepped out of that car as if he'd stepped out of my dreams, and when he looked up at the window where I stood, the years crumbled between us like they had never been. I grabbed my suitcase and hurried down the stairs, afraid the dream would vanish if I took too long. He was standing by the car, waiting. William still carried that same relaxed confidence he'd had at 26, only now it was polished by success and maturity. He wore dark jeans and a navy sweater that looked simple but expensive, but his eyes, those amber eyes that had haunted my dreams for decades, were exactly the same. I wanted to hide, to turn back, to pretend this wasn't happening. I looked terrible, my hair unkempt, my cheap clothes wrinkled. I felt small, insignificant, beside the elegant man waiting for me. But he was already smiling, a smile that made my heart leap like I was 25 again. I walked toward him slowly, suddenly unable to breathe. "Hello, Donna," he said softly. Up close, I could see what time had done. Silver hair, deep creases at the corners of his eyes, broader shoulders, a stronger frame, as though success had given him physical weight as well. But when he smiled, I saw the boy who once took me to the hills and told me about his dreams. "Hi," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. He studied my face for a long moment, those amber eyes taking in every detail. I wanted to apologize for how I looked, for how far I'd fallen, for calling him after all these years with nothing to offer but trouble. But instead he said 3 words that changed everything. "You look beautiful." And I broke. Right there, on the sidewalk, outside that shabby hotel, with William Dawson standing beside me, I completely fell apart. 40 years of bottled-up tears, 4 days of uncertainty and despair, a lifetime of being told I wasn't enough, all of it poured out in harsh, ragged sobs. He didn't say anything else. He didn't try to hush me or tell me it would be okay. He simply took my suitcase in one hand and wrapped the other arm around me as I crumbled against his chest. He smelled of expensive cologne and clean clothes, of success and steadiness, of everything I had lost and never had. "I'm sorry," I gasped into his chest. "I shouldn't have called, shouldn't have dragged you into this mess." "Shh," he murmured, his hand stroking my back. "You should have called years ago." When my sobs finally quieted, I pulled back, embarrassed by the wet stain I'd left on his fine sweater. "I must look like a wreck," I muttered. He brushed a tear from my cheek with the gentlest touch. "You look like someone who's been through hell and survived. That's not a wreck, Donna. That's strength." I let out a shaky, bitter laugh. "Strength? I'm 65, holed up in a shabby hotel because my own son doesn't want me. That's not strength, that's pathetic." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw the flash of anger he was trying to contain. "Your son is a fool. I don't need to know him. I know you." And the Donna Miller I knew would never turn her back on someone in need, especially family. The way he said my maiden name, like it was something precious he had carried with him all these years, made my chest ache for the woman I used to be. That was a long time ago. I'm not that girl anymore. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I'd like to know the woman you've become." He placed my suitcase carefully into the trunk, as if it were treasure and not just a cheap bag carrying everything I had left. Then he opened the car door for me. I stood there stunned. That morning, when my house burned, I had still had a home, a lifetime of memories. Now, I was climbing into a car with a man I hadn't seen in 4 decades, with no idea what came next. "Where are we going?" I asked as he started the engine. "Home," he said simply. An hour later, the car was winding through wealthy neighborhoods, past gated drives and immaculate lawns, until we turned onto a road I had never seen. Houses hid behind iron gates, each estate pristine. Then William pulled into a long driveway that led to a villa, its entrance marked only by a modest sign carved with the name Dawson. The house took my breath away. It wasn't flashy or gaudy, but solid, timeless, elegant stone and wood, tall windows drinking in the afternoon light, a wide porch inviting you to stay. "William," I whispered, "this is unbelievable." He turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, gazing at the house as though through my eyes. "It's too big. When I built it, I thought someday I'd fill it. But some dreams don't turn out the way we hope." "You never married?" The question slipped out. He looked at me, his eyes unreadable. "A few times I almost did, but something was always missing." He hesitated, then said softly, "You." The word hung heavy between us, carrying 4 decades of unfinished sentences. I wanted to ask what he meant, how he could say that when I had never been part of his life. But before I could, he was out of the car, opening my door. Inside was even more breathtaking. Honey-colored floors shone under vaulted ceilings. The rooms were furnished with warmth and elegance, books scattered everywhere, armchairs set by windows, family photos resting on side tables. It felt lived in, alive, not just for display. "Are you hungry?" William asked, guiding me into a kitchen as large as my old living room. "I was making lunch when you called." Only then did I realize how empty my stomach was. The hotel breakfast had been stale pastries and watery coffee. "I don't want to be a bother," I began, but he held my gaze. "Donna, don't say that. You're not a burden. You're—" He paused, searching. The answer to a question I've carried for 40 years. While he cooked, he actually knew how to cook. I looked around at photos of him cutting ribbons at building sites, shaking hands with important men. A man who had built an empire, yet still kept the amber-eyed spark of the boy who once promised he'd return to me. In the pictures, William appeared at galas and charity dinners, always smiling, yet never truly happy. Soon a plate of golden roasted chicken and fragrant pears. Vegetables was placed in front of me. "Tell me your story," he said. "About Richard, about your son, about everything I've missed." Over a meal that felt like heaven after days of tasteless hotel food, I told him. I spoke of Richard steady, reliable, a man who gave me safety and companionship, but little passion. I told him about David, the son I had prayed for and loved fiercely, who grew into a man who chose his girlfriend's comfort over his mother's need. I told him about the years spent as a good wife, a devoted mother, then a quiet widow, until the fire took what was left and my son took away the rest. William listened, never interrupting, those amber eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, he was silent for a long while before saying, "I'm sorry. Sorry for Richard, for your home, for your son, but not sorry you called me." "Why?" My voice was barely audible. He reached across the table and took my hand, still strong, still gentle, and after all these years still enough to make my heart stumble. "Because I never stopped loving you," he said quietly. "Everything I did, every success, Every dollar I made was to be worthy of you if you ever came back to me. William, that sounds crazy. It's been 4 decades. We're different people now. But when I heard your voice today, it felt like a missing piece of my life finally clicked into place. I looked at our hands, his sun-browned and strong, mine rough with age, lined with 65 years. I'm not the girl I was. No, he said, you're better. You're real. You've lived, loved, lost, endured. The 25-year-old girl was only potential. The woman you are now is what that potential became. His words wrapped around my heart like a blanket, soothing wounds I hadn't realized were still raw. For the first time in years, I felt seen not as someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's burden, but as myself. What now? I asked. William smiled, that same smile that once made me dizzy when the world was still young. Now we find out what the rest of life can be, if you'll stay with me. Sitting in that warm kitchen, surrounded by good food and new hope, I realize sometimes the fire that destroys one life clears the ground for the one we were meant to have. Living with William felt like finding a part of myself I had long forgotten. The first week was strange. We moved carefully around each other like polite strangers. He gave me an entire guest wing, larger than my old living room, with a private bath and a tub big enough for 2, even a little sitting room overlooking the garden. It felt like a luxury hotel, and I was afraid to touch anything. But William's patience, the patience only a man who had lived long and deeply could have slowly melted my hesitation. He had a housekeeper, Carol, who came 3 times a week. On the other days, I cooked for him. At first, just morning coffee, a simple lunch. But William treated it like it was priceless, as if he had been too long fed on banquets and restaurants. One evening, when he tasted a stew I made from my grandmother's recipe, he exclaimed, "This is incredible. I haven't had a home-cooked meal this good in years." "It's nothing," I said, embarrassed, though my heart glowed. When had anyone last praised my cooking? David usually complained I made the same meals over and over. Emily once suggested I modernize my flavors. William only shook his head. "Perfect. You're perfect." The word should have embarrassed me. At 65, with silver at my temples, lines carved deep in my face, spotted hands, and a body no longer firm, I was anything but perfect. But in William's eyes, I saw a woman who was beautiful, deserving of love and care. Soon, we slipped into an easy rhythm. Breakfasts on the back porch, he read work reports while I watched the birds. Afternoons wandering his gardens, admiring the set orchids in his greenhouse. Evenings filled with endless conversations. We had 40 years to make up for, and we did it carefully, slowly, like archaeologists brushing dust from something precious. I told him about the hard mornings after Richard's death, about the emptiness, the struggle to get out of bed, the loneliness of widowhood. He told me about building his company, from a small construction firm into a corporation with projects across 3 states. He told me about the women who passed through his life, smart, successful, elegant women at galas and fundraisers, yet none who made him feel whole. "There was one," he said one rainy night by the fire, rain drumming against the windows. "Her name was Elena, an architect, beautiful, brilliant. Everyone said we were meant for each other." A surprising wave of jealousy rose in me. "And?" I asked. "I proposed," he admitted. "Christmas Eve, 5 years ago. Fancy restaurant, expensive ring." She said yes. We planned a summer wedding, but the closer it came, the more I knew something was wrong. Not with her, she was flawless, but with me. He stared into the fire. The night before the wedding, I called it off. William, what did you tell her? The truth, that I was still in love with someone I had met 40 years earlier, and it wouldn't be fair to marry when my heart belonged elsewhere. His confession stunned me. He had canceled a wedding for the memory of me, for the fragile chance that one day I might need him and he would be there. I looked at this successful, handsome man and tried to process what he had just said. That's insane. Yes, he leaned over, took my hand. As insane as you keeping my card in your wallet for 40 years. He was right. We were both crazy. But it was that very madness that had brought us back together. 3 weeks after I arrived, David called. I was in the kitchen cooking dinner, humming softly something I hadn't done in years when the phone rang. Seeing his name on the screen, my stomach clenched with that old familiar dread. "Hello, son," I said, keeping my tone calm. "Mom." His voice was unusually careful. "I've been calling for weeks. It always goes to voicemail." It was true. I had been avoiding him, not ready to face the guilt or obligations he might try to press on me. "I've been busy." "Busy with what?" "I heard you left the hotel a while ago. Where are you staying?" I looked around William's beautiful kitchen, at the fresh flowers he'd bought that morning, the fine wine on the shelf. "I'm with a friend." "What friend? You don't have rich friends." His words stung, partly because they had once been true. After Richard died, I let most friendships fade, too tired and too proud to maintain connections when I had nothing left to offer. "You'd be surprised," I answered coolly. There was a pause, and I could almost hear him struggling to process. "Mom, I think we need to talk. Emily and I discussed it again, and maybe we were too hasty. You can stay in the guest room at our house for a while, until you get settled." A month earlier, that offer would have meant everything to me. Now it felt hollow, almost insulting. "What made you change your mind?" I asked. He hesitated. "We realized maybe we were too focused on our own needs. Family is supposed to stick together." I understood immediately. Someone in the neighborhood must have seen me with a well-dressed man in a luxury car. David's curiosity had turned into generosity. "That's kind of you," I said. "But I'm very happy where I am now." "Mom, you can't just move into a stranger's house. It's dangerous. What do you even know about him?" "I know he's never made me feel like a burden," I replied softly. I knew William valued my presence. He loved the meals I cooked, and every day he told me I was beautiful. This wedding was nothing like my first. When I married Richard 40 years ago, everything was about what other people expected. The white dress, the church ceremony, the reception at the community center with a DJ and a prepaid bar. We invited everyone we knew, even people we didn't particularly like, because that's what was done. Back then, the ritual had been for the community, not for us. But this time, William and I did only what we wanted. The ceremony was held in his backyard on a crisp November morning, exactly 5 months after that fateful phone call at the hotel. The pastor was an old friend of William's, and the only witnesses were Carol, his housekeeper, and Michael, his business partner and closest friend for 25 years. I wore a simple blue dress that William said matched my eyes. He wore a gray suit that made him look distinguished and handsome. No flash, no pretense, no effort to impress anyone. Just two people who had found each other again after 40 years, promising to walk together through whatever time remained. David came to the wedding. I had debated whether to even invite him, but William convinced me to try once more. "He's your son," he said simply. "You'll regret it if you don't give him the chance to do right." So I called David 2 weeks before the ceremony. William and I are getting married on November 15th at 2 p.m. You're welcome to come, but Emily is not invited." He showed up alone, looking uncomfortable in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. He shook William's hand politely, made a little small talk, even managed to smile when the pastor pronounced us husband and wife. But I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he silently took inventory of William's house, his car, the obvious signs of wealth. This morning, I woke in William's arms, in my husband's arms, in the room that is now ours, in the house that is now our home. Sunlight streamed through the windows, overlooking the gardens we tend together, and I breathed in the smell of the coffee William makes every morning before I wake. At 66, I am happier than I have ever been. Not because of William's money, or his beautiful house, or his success, but because someone sees me, truly sees me, and chooses to love what he sees. The fire took my old life, burned it down to ashes. But sometimes I think destruction is just another word for renewal. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find everything you really needed. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, first love gets a second chance to become forever. The business card I kept for 40 years is now framed, sitting on William's desk in his office. A reminder that some promises are worth keeping, even if it takes 4 decades to fulfill them. I share this story not just to tell you about my own life, but to remind you that everyone has had their own fire, the kind that burned their life down. And yet, from the ashes, a new beginning can still rise. What about you? Have you ever lost something only to find a different part of yourself in the aftermath? Share your story in the comments. I believe every experience carries a lesson we can all learn from. And if you'd like to walk with me through more journeys of love, family, and the lessons life teaches us, make sure you follow so you won't miss the next story.